Chambord, the dream of a young man with the heart of a medieval knight and the mind of a Renaissance patron. The pleasure palace of a king who sought empire and women with equal passion. During the day, the cries of the royal hunt filled the air. At night, music and whispers of intrigue and romance filled the halls. Join us for a tour of this jewel on the French crown, next on Great Castles of Europe. This is the fertile, sunny valley of the Loire River. The Loire runs through the heart of France, both geographically and spiritually. It was here that, in the course of a century of war with England, the idea of France as a nation took shape. Here that the enemy was turned back. And it was here that the kings and queens of France chose to build the most beautiful castles in the world. The year 1520. France prospers under its new king, a young man with a taste for architecture, beautiful women, and the hunt. He has endless ambition for himself and his country. He hopes one day to be an emperor, another Charlemagne. He is determined to make French culture the envy of Renaissance Europe. He conceives of a fantastic creation in the midst of this game-filled forest, the largest, most extravagant, most modern construction of its day, an incomparable palace to astonish the world for generations to come. Chambord. With its many turrets, dormers, and towers, the chateau has been likened both to an overcrowded chessboard and a woman whose hair has been blown loose by the wind. Surely the romantic young king whose dream gave birth to Chambord would have preferred the latter account. Francis I was barely 20 years old when he succeeded his cousin to the throne in the year 1515. Raised and indulged by his widowed mother, Francis grew up steeped in the blossoming arts of the Renaissance. He grew to love tales of knightly bravery and courtly love more than his Latin letters. He preferred the thrill of the hunt to the finer points of statecraft. But he was intelligent and good-hearted, and after a long line of drab and sickly monarchs, the people of France were delighted with their dashing young king. Shortly after his coronation, Francis set off to Italy to win back the Duchy of Milan, which had been lost, regained, and lost again by his family. To the astonishment of all of Europe, he succeeded. During his triumphant tour of Milan, Francis saw firsthand the works of the Renaissance artists and architects he'd learned of as a child. He returned to France with more than a victory, taking home a passion for the things of the Italian Renaissance and dreams of equaling them in his own realm. He even succeeded in persuading an aging Leonardo da Vinci to accompany him back to France, along with the famous painting La Gioconda, better known as the Mona Lisa. With Leonardo's help, Francis set about fulfilling his architectural dreams, first by enlarging this castle at Blois. But Blois belonged to his queen and his children. His stature as a Renaissance monarch demanded that he have his own stately castle, the likes of which Europe had never seen before. His eye would settle on the outskirts of the great forest of Chambord. Some say it was the love of a woman that brought him here, his illicit affair with the beautiful countess who lived nearby. It's just as likely that the abundant game lured Francis to Chambord. And although the marshy ground made the building site less than ideal, Francis had made his decision. His castle would go here. In 1519, workers began the daunting task of clearing and enclosing the estate. They built a 21-mile wall around the grounds, an enormous undertaking that encircled an area the size of Paris. It was a magical time. Francis seemed destined for greatness. Already he was being called a second Charlemagne. But in Germany, another young man was assuming a position of power, a new ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V. Just 19 years old, he controlled both Germany and Spain, but longed for more. France and its ambitious young king stood in the way. No one knows exactly who designed Chambord. Clearly it bears the mark of Leonardo da Vinci, but he died just before construction began in 1519. Leonardo's death was a blow to Francis, who revered the artist. One historian movingly describes how the young king held the dying Leonardo's head in his last moments. In truth, Francis was far away, celebrating the birth of his second son, when news of Leonardo's death reached him. The design of Chambord reflects Francis's desire to remake the Italian Renaissance in a French image. The square keep is Italian, but the massive corner towers are French medieval. The room plan is unique, centering on a Greek cross that divides the keep into 4 separate blocks. Where the arms of the cross meet, a magnificent spiral staircase rises. It's constructed so cleverly that someone ascending can see those descending without ever meeting them, because there are actually 2 flights of stairs wrapped around each other. This is the genius of Leonardo da Vinci. These drawings by Leonardo show a staircase designed with 4 distinct flights of stairs. It's likely that the great artist drew these for Chambord, but the master masons overseeing the construction of the chateau simplified the design to just 2 flights. The staircase remains a marvel of engineering and ingenuity to this day. The resulting castle would be all Francis had hoped, an astonishing combination of French tradition, Italian Renaissance, and the genius and whimsy of Leonardo. Of course, Francis made sure that his own mark would be prominently displayed throughout the castle. Another symbol of Francis adorns the castle throughout, the salamander. In legend, the salamander walked through fire unscathed. Francis's mother chose it as a symbol of strength and courage for her son. Here, too, the young king's fierce ambition for empire can be seen. Above the head of each beast is a closed imperial crown, an audacious mark for a mere king. In truth, only his grim young rival Charles V would wear the imperial crown. Francis and his castle would pay dearly for his imperial ambitions. In 1525, at the Battle of Pavia, the fates went his enemy's way. Francis was wounded and captured. For a year he languished in a Spanish prison, and building at Chambord came to a halt. In 1526, Francis was able to return to Chambord, more anxious than ever to finish his palace. He had won his release at great cost. Part of France went to Charles V, and Francis's 2 sons went as hostages as well. It was probably during these visits to the building site that Francis decided to add wings to the square keep. Perhaps only then did he realize that the perfect symmetry of the keep had its drawbacks. It divided the chateau into 32 identical apartments, and a king with dreams of empire could hardly live in exactly the same accommodations as his subjects. To preserve that neat symmetry, Francis would add 2 wings, one for the royal apartments and one for the chapel. Thus, the new design would pay tribute to both God and king. But the symmetry is deceptive. A close look at the main facade reveals the royal wing to be slightly smaller than the wing containing the chapel. It's thought that the marshy ground may have forced the builders to lay the foundation for the royal apartments closer to the keep than had been planned. There are other differences in the wings, best seen in the matching staircases on either side. The richly carved one ascending to the royal apartments dates from the 1540s. The one on the opposite side, completed 15 years later, is markedly simpler in decoration. From 1526 on, 1,800 men labored continuously on the building of the chateau. The pleasure palace at Chambord gradually took shape and was ready to greet its first visitors. Francis I was never quite the same after his imprisonment in Spain. The ceaseless struggle with his mortal enemy Charles V took its toll. He was no longer the light-hearted knight. Hunting, one of the great delights of his youth, increasingly became an escape from troubles on his frontiers, and so he and his sumptuous court came to Chambord on such escapes. During the summer, Chambord lay empty. Hunting was a winter pastime. The king would organize hunting trips for his court that lasted from a few days to a few weeks. Hundreds of servants and perhaps 1,000 horses would move from chateau to chateau, lugging all of the furniture, tapestries, chandeliers, clothes, and china that such a royal gathering would require. Readying the chateau for the arrival of the king's court was no simple task. Typical of Francis's flair for the grandiose, the numbers of the court swelled during his reign, including many women of rank. He was fond of saying that a court without beautiful ladies was like a spring without roses. Eventually, his retinue filled every room in the keep, including these large attic rooms. On arrival, the servants would set about transforming the chilly stone castle into a warm and welcoming palace, lighting the fireplaces in each room, hanging tapestries and thick velvet wall coverings. The servants would fit slats of wood into these slots and plaster them with mud and grass. Markings on the beams guided the reassembly. It's no coincidence that the roof beams resemble the ribs of a boat. The roof was built by shipbuilders who worked on the castle during the winter months when the shipyards were closed. Construction of the royal wing was not completed until 1547, the same year Francis died. He may have stayed here in the magnificent king's bedroom during his last visits to Chambord that year, surrounded by those closest to him. In those times, the king might share his bed not only with his wife, but with a favored guest as well. Privacy was not considered a luxury. A retinue of servants surrounded the king, whether he was holding court, hunting in the woods, or asleep in his bed. At night, the servants would sleep in foldable cots around their lord's bed. Francis's presence can be felt everywhere here. The king's study, attached to the bedroom, was designed to offer him a retreat from the hubbub of the court. The richly carved ceiling bears his initial, F, and his totem, the salamander. The king's passion for architecture did not stop at Chambord. In fact, no other French monarch would build as many castles, but it was here at Chambord that his vision of a wholly French Renaissance reached its pinnacle. Here, Francis spared no expense, no effort. Here he indulged every flight of architectural fancy. In many ways, Chambord is as impractical as it is beautiful. Certainly the chateau was not designed with the servants' convenience in mind. No permanent kitchens were built, since the castle was left empty except for a week or two a year. Servants had to cook food in fireplaces in the basement and then carry it up staircases and down long halls to reach the royal apartments. More often than not, the food arrived cold. Therefore, in rooms adjoining each main apartment, so-called potagers were built. Here the food could be rewarmed. Chambord's finest moment, and perhaps Francis's only real triumph over his rival, Charles V, came in 1539. During one of the short-lived truces between the two, Francis threw a week-long reception for his mortal enemy. It is said that swarms of young ladies preceded the emperor wherever he went, scattering rose petals in his path. Charles was suitably impressed, declaring Chambord and its trimmings a synthesis of all that human effort can achieve. On the occasion of such royal visits, days were filled with the hunt. According to tradition, the unique terraces at Chambord were constructed so that the ladies of the court could follow the hunts and admire the gallantry of their lords. It is more likely that these are another mark of the great Leonardo da Vinci, designed to provide a perfect vantage from which to marvel at the forest of fantastic shapes rising from the upper level. Nights at Chambord were for feasting and frolicking. Guests would gather on and around the spiral staircase, whispering and shouting. On the second floor of the keep, music and dancing filled the rooms radiating from the staircase. At night, during the great balls held here, Chambord took on the air of the fairy tale palace of Apollodon the magician, a character from a 14th century Spanish novel of romantic chivalry. Francis had it translated from its original Spanish, and his court gallantly set about emulating it. Chambord's flamboyant outlines might have come straight out of an illuminated medieval manuscript. They capture the romantic mood of a passing age that Francis, the great Renaissance patron, never stopped celebrating. The death of Francis in 1547 spelled the end of the golden age of the Loire Valley. The royal family moved to Paris to be closer to the political center of France. For most of the next 400 years, Chambord lay empty, impossibly beautiful, and virtually impossible to live in. Various owners and VIP guests took up temporary residence here from time to time, each leaving his or her mark, to the extent that much of the feel of the Renaissance chateau was lost. But the central staircase and surrounding galleries remained untouched and were never to lose their power to enchant and intrigue. The double spiral of this staircase made it a favorite place for children to play hide and seek. The wealth of decorative carvings here make it one of the finest examples of the Renaissance carver's art to be found in France, as well as a child's delight. Periodically, Chambord showed the signs of neglect. Decorative features crumbled, roofs leaked, and a number of walls threatened to fall down. Under Louis XIV, Chambord came back to life briefly. The Sun King was thoroughly enchanted by this magnificent building, an architectural foreshadowing of Versailles. He began restorations and built this apartment in the center of the keep, leaving the royal wing unoccupied. Wood paneling, hangings, and parquet flooring brought new comfort to the castle. In keeping with the new fashions of the court, small rooms for maids and servants were added adjoining a few of the main bedrooms. But again, Chambord refused to succumb to domesticity. Although used occasionally as a hunting lodge for the royals and their favorites, most of the time it remained empty. One of the few people to try to live here on a permanent basis was the Marshal of Saxony. He'd been given the chateau by Louis XV after his brilliant victory at the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745. The Marshal moved in lavishly and brought with him 2 cavalry regiments that he housed in the outbuildings. He tried to solve the heating problem by installing 4 of these enormous ceramic stoves imported from Germany. The Marshal lived high and hard. A notorious womanizer, he is said to have seduced the famous actress Madame Favart at Chambord. When the Marshal of Saxony died, the cannons of the main courtyard, in keeping with his will, fired a salvo once every quarter of an hour for 6 days. The building of Chambord was never actually finished. Craftsmen and builders have been at work here on and off for nearly 500 years. The restoration goes on to this day, carried out with the same painstaking craftsmanship as under the watchful eye of Francis I. After the masons have set the stoneworkers carve out the magnificent details. This F alone will take some 3 days to complete. Despite the extensive restorations, some of the original stones remain. This one dates from 1533. This is the second major restoration of the lantern tower that crowns the central staircase. During the first restoration in the 1700s, workmen removed most of the original structure and stored it under cover from the weather in a ground floor room under the royal apartments. There it remains to this day. Chambord is now a national treasure, a mecca for tourists, and a stately hunting preserve for the presidents of France and their honored guests. In one sense, despite the passage of centuries, Chambord is still suspended at a momentous crossroads of history, a time when the romance and superstition of the Middle Ages were giving way to the rationality of the Renaissance. In this, it is a remarkable reflection of the idealistic young man who built it. At the heart of a great forest, the magical vision of a man who was at once medieval knight and Renaissance philosopher king remains. Chambord. Chenonceau. It floats in a timeless trance, suspended between water and sky. Fashioned by the imagination and passion of 7 remarkable women, it is known as the Ladies' Castle. Its story is a stirring drama of French romance, money, and intrigue. Join us for a tour of this majestic treasure of the French Renaissance, next on Great Castles of Europe. In France's Loire Valley, among rolling farms and stately woodlands, kings, politicians, and bankers have traditionally sought refuge from the din of worldly events. This is Chateau country, the soul of gracious living, set in the heart of France. Here in the province of Touraine, spanning the placid river Cher, is an exquisite miniature of a castle, Chenonceau. It is a charmed product of the Renaissance, a fulfillment of the new desire for light and lightness. It is delicate but enduring, complex but balanced, fanciful but disciplined. Chenonceau's history is a tableau of 7 personalities, 7 strong and worldly women who embroidered its history with spice and drama. Like all castles, Chenonceau began as a strategic stronghold, in this case as a small fortified mansion with a mill set into the granite bed of the river Cher. This was the estate of the once powerful Mark family. It was built in 1513, when Michelangelo had just finished the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. England, Rome, and Spain were about to invade France, and the Mark estate was snatched up by Thomas Boyer, an ambitious financier who'd had his eye on the mansion for years. His wife Catherine oversaw Chenonceau's beginnings. Over the flowing water, on the robust piers and foundation of the stone mill, she built a structure that was part of the land, part of the river. From its square base, Catherine drew an elegantly complex form of projecting towers and rhythmic windows. The varied roofline's angles are echoed in her additions to the old tower keep. The diverse shapes, the great windows, and the detail of the structure make this dense stone seem light and airy. Inside, Madame Boyer extended this sense of airiness and space with a design innovation that was unique to France, a hallway. From this ample passage, separate doors lead to private living quarters. Previously, these rooms would have all adjoined. The detail of the interiors reflects Catherine's breeding as a woman of means and refined tastes. Her husband had married well and gave her carte blanche to fulfill her vision of a Renaissance palace. In return, she chose Europe's finest craftsmen to create an estate that would advance his aspirations for the Boyer clan. This is the oldest and finest carved wooden ceiling of the French Renaissance. From Italy, the castle's first lady brought this novelty to France, a straight rather than a curved staircase. By 1517, most of the house was complete, and King Francis I praised it as the beautiful palace and house situated on the river Cher, where we might sometimes stay. Cardinal Boyer, a relative, sanctified this intimate chapel. Madame Boyer had skillfully begun what would become one of France's true architectural gems. Again and again throughout the castle, her husband engraved his motto, but its meaning, as shown on the Renaissance chimney in the sitting room, could as easily apply to Catherine Boyer. It says, "If the building is finished, it will preserve my memory." memory finally bequeathed by Chenonceau's First Lady was one of hospitality and welcoming. Chenonceau was a castle in name only. It is actually a chateau, which has the flavor of a castle, as a liqueur has the flavor of a fruit. By the 16th century, mobile artillery had made all but the most massive fortifications obsolete. Chenonceau's turrets and stone walls are disciplined, yet romantic retellings of medieval defenses. Discipline, mixed with awesome beauty and ambition, described the next woman to favor Chenonceau with the spark of her personality. Diane de Poitiers. Gorgeous and witty, known to favor dressing in black and white, Diane would create here the finest garden in all of France. And through sheer guile and force of her will, she would also fulfill Boyer's ambition, making Chenonceau a resplendent center of French court life. Diane had been King Henry II's governess. Though 15 years his senior, she later became his mistress and lifelong infatuation. In 1547, Henry presented the beautiful Diane with Chenonceau, after Madame Boyer's son lost it in bankruptcy. Diane immediately set about embellishing the castle interiors, commissioning this magnificent carved fireplace for her bedroom. Diane's favor with the king would ultimately make her suffer at the hands of this woman, the king's wife, Queen Catherine. But Diane Poitiers was a more than equal adversary. She styled herself Diane the Huntress and usually got what she went after. Realizing she would lose Chenonceau if anything happened to Henry, she took decisive steps to make the estate legally hers. Through daring court work, she annulled the decree that transferred Chenonceau from the bankrupt Boyer family to the crown. Diane knew the penniless Boyer heirs couldn't afford the debt that came with the castle. She bought Chenonceau for a song. Next, the new owner launched a Napoleonic campaign to make Chenonceau's farms show a profit. Diane had grand plans for renovating the castle's interior and grounds, but the money had to come from somewhere. With a born manager's efficiency, she created a plan of business investment and expansion. Volumes of records account for every franc she spent. Each meticulous entry is written in her own hand. First, she increased Chenonceau's land holdings and rents and started a new building program. To save money, she cut back on the wages of her staff, reducing her state manager's salary by 30% and taking away his heating and food allowance. Vineyards were planted and new farm buildings sprang up. From her startled employees, Diane demanded regular progress reports. The farm started making real money. The Loire Valley drank good country wine from Diane's wine presses and ate juicy peach apricots from her orchards. And the castle's entrepreneurial mistress didn't stop there. To create the finest garden in France, Diane commissioned 14,000 days of work from local laborers. 9,000 wild violet and strawberry plants were gathered from local woods. 150 mulberry trees were shipped in to feed silkworms Diane bought for manufacturing raw silk. To protect it all, terraces were built high enough to stop a flood, using 7,000 wheelbarrows of stone. Diane's work had taken on the scale of a monument, as majestic an achievement as the castle itself. As a crowning touch, Diane built an elegant bridge across the River Cher, never imagining that this bridge would one day save the castle itself. In just a few years, young Diane had tripled Chenonceau's profits and the value of the estate. Still, it was her rare beauty rather than brains that won her favor and power in France's loftiest circles. This beauty, it was said, came from a daily bath in the Cher, the river that ran beneath her beloved Chenonceau. But in the end, Diane lost both her lungs. In a hapless joust at a festival tournament, her patron and lover, King Henry II, caught the point of a lance and died. Then, despite Diane's legal ownership, her hated rival, the Queen, finally claimed the castle for herself. This painting shows Diane portrayed as the Greek goddess of the hunt, now banished from Chenonceau. The next strong woman to occupy the river chateau was none other than the long-suffering Queen Catherine, King Henry II's widowed wife. Any normal woman would have been crushed by years of lopsided comparison with the heavenly Diane. But Catherine was a Medici of the Italian merchant clan. After Henry's death, she set out to best Diane the Huntress in everything. And in her first act, she would drive herself nearly insane. To honor her late husband, she had his monogram, an H, displayed prominently around the castle. She also added double C's, her own initials. When she combined them, which was the convention of the time, the results were horrifying. D's, 2 of them, everywhere, the sign of her nemesis, Diane. Diane had been a manager, but Catherine was a queen, one with lots of catching up to do. She began her regal building program by enlarging the chateau. First, she built a 2-story gallery on top of the bridge created by Diane. This would be the grand reception hall her rival had gone without, and Catherine planned many receptions, for now she could afford them. The estate was turning even greater profits. The vineyards had become famous. Silk was spun right on the estate, creating the sought-after Queen's cloth. In Catherine's time, gay festivities lit up Chenonceau, while bloody conflict darkened Paris. Religious reform smoldered throughout the continent. France was surrounded by enemies. Chenonceau became the Queen's stage for statecraft. Like a business lunch in New York, a ball in Touraine was a forum for serious negotiation and alliance building. Catherine's plans for Chenonceau grew more grandiose, just as her funds started to dwindle. The castle bears the scars of her ambition. To this day, the south end of the gallery is marred by unfinished masonry work. Fortunately, Catherine's greatest plan for Chenonceau never left the drawing board. It was for the best. The castle's charm would have been swallowed in this gaudy expansion. Modest improvements were still possible. To cater the outlandishly lavish celebrations she loved to stage, Catherine enlarged the kitchens. The Queen planted her own, more formal garden in her native Italian style, fragrant with lemon and orange trees, cooled by fountains and graced by sculpture. These gardens were the site of Catherine's most extravagant celebration. Many of the court women came dressed as men, and the serving women dressed hardly at all. Catherine loved a party. This infamous event became known as the Festival of the Three Queens. Even for Renaissance France, it was an extravagant affair. Staged as an enormous play, its balls, feasts, and masquerades went on for 5 full days. The nights shimmered with thousands of candles, glittered with jewels and brocade, sang with violins. The king appeared as a queen in sparkling drag, accompanied by his favorite boys, known as the cuties. It was difficult to tell, wrote one guest, if one saw a man queen or a woman king. In 1584, the celebrations came to an end. Catherine left Chenonceau to avoid a wave of the plague. She died in the cold beginning of 1589 at Blois, willing the chateau and its estate to her daughter-in-law, Louise of Lorraine, France's new queen. Instead of parties, the castle's next mistress would deck the castle in mourning. In the summer of that year, King Henry III was mortally wounded by an assassin. In his last letter to Louise, he asked her to wait for him at Chenonceau. She did. For 15 years, Louise threw herself into a mourning every bit as theatrical as Catherine's galas, dressed always in the royal mourning costume of white. The castle on the Cher fell quiet, languishing in silence as a virtual tomb. As an interior decorator, the grieving Louise was severe. She painted the walls and ceilings of her chambers black. Themes of death stood out in white against the black. These white plumes covering the walls are an ancient French symbol signifying pain. Elsewhere, tears of grief compete with gravediggers' pickaxes and spades, as well as scratching thorns. Louise had buried herself alive. While arguably deranged, in her self-imposed exile, she carried on charitable work and became known with respect and gratitude as the White Lady of Chenonceau. She also immersed herself in religion, praying at this chapel 4 times a day and adorning the castle with Christian motifs. Her dreams of turning Chenonceau into a convent would not be realized in her lifetime. In 1601, the castle on the Cher passed into the hands of its 5th lady, Françoise de Mercure, daughter-in-law to King Henry IV. She turned out to be the manager Louise never was. For the next 12 years, she worked hard to reverse the structural decay that in her grief Louise had ignored. But now the monarchy of France was changing. Chenonceau became a backwater, a destination only for the hunting season. It saw its last royal visit when Louis XIV passed through in 1650. It was then that permission was finally granted for a Capuchin nunnery to be established in the attic rooms above the main house. The nuns, like other women, left their mark. Here at the head of the grand staircase, at the entrance to the convent, a ceremonial drawbridge separated the brides of Christ from worldly matters. The next mistress of Chenonceau was considerably more lively. The daughter of an actress in the Comédie Française, wife of a wealthy banker, she was a brilliant sun around which the intellectual stars of France revolved, Louise Dupin. The Dupins lived in the center of Paris, but in the autumn, Turenn's most beautiful season, Chenonceau once again became the playground of nobility. But these were the nobles of a new and deadly France. To escape the terror in 1782, Louise Dupin left Paris to live at Chenonceau year-round. It may have saved her life. The French Revolution reached out for her. As a wealthy bourgeois, she was denounced by the Revolutionary Committee. Chenonceau, as a symbol of royal excess, was ordered burned. But the people of Turenne blocked the way. Madame Dupin had been kind, even letting them cross Chenonceau's bridge through the ornate gallery. Her life was spared. The bridge also saved the chateau itself. You cannot burn Chenonceau, the local Monsignor argued. It is the only bridge across the Cher for miles. A few fleurs-de-lis were knocked off, some paintings, and a few pieces of royal furniture were burned in the revolutionary bonfire, but the graceful composition of stone and spirit lived on. In 1799, after the terror, and in the glorious autumn of Turenne, Madame Dupin died at 93 and was buried, according to her wishes, in the woods of Chenonceau. In the 19th century, about the time of the American Civil War, her heirs sold Chenonceau to another wealthy woman, Madame Pelouse. Like 6 women before her, she succumbed to the estate's charm and dedicated herself to a massive restoration campaign, rebuilding, repairing, and replacing. These caryatids, sculptural columns flanking the grand entrance, were moved from the front to the gardens. The bulk of Madame Pelouse's work was dedicated to similar tasks, undoing the ostentatious building and alterations ordered by the chateau's third owner, Catherine de' Medici. But by now the castle badly needed basic structural repair. Ruined roofs and windows were lovingly restored to their former glory. Madame Pelouse stripped the interior of the clutter that had accumulated in the intervening years. Restoring medieval and Renaissance buildings had become a craze of the period, and Madame Pelouse joined it with the utmost enthusiasm. Her goal was nothing less than restoring Chenonceau to its original Renaissance elegance and simplicity. In the process, she ran through her entire fortune. She resorted to taking out loans, but paid little attention to the mounting interest. Every ceiling of the proud chateau had by now collapsed. The only exception was this one in Catherine de' Medici's library. Even today, it bears the original paintwork from the era of that imperious lady. There are Catherine's entwined initials. In between restoration projects, Madame Pelouse briefly revived Chenonceau's festive past. On one of those occasions, to evoke true Renaissance spirit, Italian gondoliers punted along the River Cher. But by then, the estate looked considerably better than Madame Pelouse's bank accounts. Creditors paid their respects at the castle. In 1888, the French Land Bank took possession from the last of Chenonceau's grand ladies. Today, the majestic Chenonceau is once again self-supporting. Once more, its gardens are a scene of constant activity, in a style that would make Diane de Poitiers, their original landscaper, proud. The jewel of the Cher is still in private hands, owned now by the Meunier family, France's famous chocolatiers. Tourism has turned the Grand Chateau into a playground the public, not just princes, can enjoy. They are drawn here by this timeless reflection of Chenonceau's 7 mistresses, their taste and wit, intelligence and will. Its elegance and charm are now ours to share. A lightness gliding serenely above the dark waters.